What's up, This is the Russian dude. Ukrainian military leaders are reporting that Ukraine captured more terrain in February than it lost. A statement that suggests that the winter fighting season may have seen a moment of momentum for Kiev, even as Russia continues to sustain pressure along multiple front lines. At the same time, the next round of peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, brokered by the United States, faces uncertainty about location and timing because of, well, you guessed it, instability in the Middle East that could divert political attention and logistical capacity away from European diplomacy. Then we also have emerging reporting that highlighted how German-manufactured components are still showing up inside Russian drones, exposing vulnerabilities in sanctions enforcement, and providing once again how global supply chains intersect with battlefield technologies. These top 3 news, battlefield dynamics, diplomacy under pressure, and technological supply, in addition to a couple other news that we'll talk about in today's episode, will set the backbone for today's chapters. As we move through each one of them, we will examine not just what's happened, but why it mattered and how it fits into the next shift in this unnecessary prolonged conflict. So let's begin with the first major update and what the numbers from the front mean for both sides in this 4-year-long struggle. In an operational report released today, Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrskyi stated that Ukrainian forces captured more territory over the course of February 2026 than the Russian military was able to claim, signaling a rare turn in tactical balance that reflects both refined Ukrainian clearing operations and a relative slowdown in Russian advances over the harsh winter months. His literal quote goes pretty much as following: Ukraine captured more territory than it lost to Russia over February 2026, Syrskyi says. According to open source analysis and Ukrainian military communications, the gains were made mostly in the border area between Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions, a terrain without major geographical obstacles, where both armies and both sides have alternated positional control throughout the winter. At the same time, independent tracking projects noted that Russian forces continue to hold tactical initiative in other sectors, for example around the Siversk area in Donetsk region, even though at a slower pace than earlier in this war. The question now is the following: why is all of this significant? First of all, after 4 years of grueling attrition around largely static front lines, even modest monthly gains measured in dozens of square kilometers, not just few meters, all this can translate to tangible operational breathing room, especially when coordinated with logistics, force rotation, and integrated defense responses that pull pressure away from these critical checkpoints. Second, this sort of relative advance in deep winter terrain demonstrates that both sides are adjusting their force postures and tactical approaches, with Ukraine increasingly relying on intelligence-led clearing operations and counter-infiltration efforts that aim to prevent Russian small units from exploiting weak spots at night. And finally, while raw territorial measurements do not capture the full complexity of combat effectiveness, they do still matter politically. What I mean by that is that leaders in Kiev and in allied capitals often use physical metrics like terrain held to justify future arms commitments and strategic support packages provided by Western partners. So if February's relative gains mark a small rebound for Ukraine's forces, what does that tell us about the present and the future of the front, and how is Russia adjusting its own strategy in response? That evolving dynamic is central to today's next topic, Russia's current offensive campaign assessment from a major Western think tank, you've probably heard about it, the Institute for the Study of War, which paints a picture of how Moscow's military leadership sees the next phase of this conflict and whether Russia is on track to sustain its current effort. So let's move straight to this institutional assessment in our next chapter. To make sense of the current fighting posture and Russian objectives on the battlefield, analysts at the Institute for the Study of War have released an updated assessment of Russia's offensive campaign as of March 1, 2026, providing a real-time snapshot of how the campaign is evolving under both operational and geopolitical pressures. This assessment, which we are going to speak about right now, compiled from satellite imagery, open-source battlefield reporting, and ground-level intelligence, highlights a persistently dynamic frontline where both sides are recalibrating forces based on weather conditions, logistics, and evolving priorities. One important theme from this assessment is that Russia continues to pursue offensive operations across multiple front lines, despite significant international pressure and enduring manpower crisis and strains, bringing also new units and shifting resources to sectors where Kyiv has shown at least occasional signs of advantage. At the same time, Ukrainian forces have strengthened their own defensive coordination and leveraged Western-provided intelligence support to anticipate and prevent several Russian attacks, particularly in the central and southern front segments. To speak about core segment of this Institute for the Study of War Analysis is that neither side is approaching a decisive breakthrough in the short term, meaning that operations are likely to remain characterized by positional battles, incremental gains, and costly contests for geographic objectives, rather than just these sweeping maneuvers and breakthroughs. From Russia's perspective, sustaining an offensive campaign throughout 2026 depends on a combination of a political will, industrial resilience, and external supply chains, all of which are under significant strain due to sanctions, recruitment bottlenecks, and the difficulty of maintaining high operational tempo across 1,000+ kilometer front line. For Ukraine, on the other hand, the Ukrainian armed forces' decision to exploit winter conditions, often viewed historically as advantageous for defense, and you probably know the examples. So basically, to harvest gains where possible reflects a broader doctrine of preserving force and maximizing tactical engagement, rather than force-on-force attrition that larger armies might favor. As a result of this, these elements suggest that while both sides are entrenching and recalibrating, progress will likely be incremental and planned, shaped by shifting domestic political support, allied contributions, and the evolving international strategic involvement in which neither Kyiv nor Moscow operates in isolation. Guys, I would like to share with you some photos and videos from Russia, Ukraine, and Iran, things like combat footage, drone footage, missile attacks. Well, but obviously this will not ever pass YouTube guidelines and filters. So if you want to see them all, I uploaded it to my Patreon, the link is down below. This is also one of the best ways to support our channel. Thanks much, now let's continue to the next chapter. In another major development, new rounds of peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, brokered principally by the United States, are supposed to take place this week. But they may be relocated from their intended venue in Abu Dhabi, because of obvious rising instability in the Middle East. As a result of all this, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky confirmed that this round of talks, originally scheduled for early March in the United Arab Emirates, could instead be shifted to alternative diplomatic hubs such as Turkey or Switzerland, due to ongoing hostilities outside of Europe that are consuming diplomatic efforts and complicating logistical arrangements. And also the underlying challenge here is that while both Kyiv and Moscow have signaled a willingness to return to the negotiating table, as always Russia does, right? Real progress on the core issues such as territorial control, security guarantees, and post-war arrangements, all of this remains still elusive. And the broader regional context is making it way harder for key mediators to maintain consistent focus. So this kind of push-pull between military operation and diplomatic engagement reflects the sheer complexity of trying to end a multi-dimensional conflict while also managing global geopolitical pressures, such as the recent, once again, instability in the Middle East that we will talk about in our final chapter, that obviously dominated urgent attention from Western capitals and captured media attention. From a strategic viewpoint, the potential relocation of the talks signals both the fragility and the persistence of diplomatic efforts. Fragile because they are susceptible to external shocks, and persistent because all sides continue to see some value in the opening space for negotiation, even if progress is slow, well, but at least there is progress. And so, as a result, as these negotiations move from plan A to potential plan B or even C, the important insight for our audience is not just the immediate venue change, but what it reveals about the interplay between frontline pressures and international diplomatic momentum, which often pull in different directions even as both sides seek to preserve a path forward, some kind of negotiated settlement. And so now, before we briefly talk about Russia's response to an attack against its supposed ally, Iran, let's talk about German components that are being discovered once again in Russian drones. How did they even end up there? What it means for the current alliances and for the future of the war? Let's talk about it in our next chapter. On the technology topic, recent reporting from Ukrainian intelligence officials and investigative outlets indicate that Russian armed forces are still obtaining German-made electronic components for their drones, despite extensive sanctions and export restrictions imposed on military-relevant goods since 2022. To begin with, according to analysts from Ukrainian defense intelligence, individual Russian drones, including models derived from the Iranian-designed Shahed drones, have been found to contain German-manufactured transistors supplied by Infineon Technologies, suggesting that sanctions components continue to flow to Russia through complex supply chain workarounds involving intermediaries, shell companies, and third-party vendors, third-party countries. But why does this all matter so much for the broader conflict? Well, first, it highlights how sanctions, while undeniably impactful, can be avoided while global supply networks are so vast and when determined actors are prepared to exploit loopholes or shady trade channels to keep critical technologies moving. Second, the presence of high-quality foreign components within Russian drones underscores the reality that modern warfare is not just about ammunition and troop numbers, but also about the microelectronics and embedded systems that make unmanned platforms effective. From the very simple, I guess, quote-unquote, guidance systems to even navigation electronics, the most complex one of them. And finally, the third one, that these supply chain dynamics feed directly back into both battlefield effectiveness and diplomatic leverage, because allies seeking to tighten enforcement must balance economic ties and export controls while staying ahead of the ingenuity that rises on the other side. So as you can see, this intersection of industry, sanctions and military technology reveals that conflicts like the one in Ukraine are a much of a global commerce and regulatory complexity as they are about troop movements and territorial control. And as we look now outward to the strategic partnerships that lay the foundation of supply flows, we exactly see how Russia's broader foreign relations, particularly with partners like Iran, factor into both Moscow's access to hardware and geopolitical backdrop that frames this entire war. And so now finally, speaking about Iran, let's now speak about the reaction of Russia to the most recent events unfolding in this country. Lastly, a nuanced report from the Kyiv Independent highlights the complex and asymmetric nature of the Russian-Iran relationship, which has become foundational to the Russia's access to certain drones and munitions, while also exposing key limits to the partnership itself. To begin with, Iran has been a major supplier of drones, ammunition and other hardware to Russian forces throughout the Ukrainian conflict, as we all know, helping Moscow to expand its unmanned aerial capabilities and sustain persistent airborne operations, particularly when Russian domestic production itself was just still ramping up. At the same time, as Iranian forces have faced military setbacks in other theaters and as domestic pressures have intensified due to sanctions and regional tensions, Russia, despite its deep rhetorical commitment to the partnership, has not always matched Iran's expectations when Iran itself faced external threats. And so, as a result, this asymmetry suggests that while Russia needs Iranian technology and supply pipelines, Moscow's ability, or better say willingness, to support its allies in times of broader conflict, especially when its own war effort in Ukraine consumes so much material and political capital, well, this willingness is obviously constrained. And from Ukraine's perspective, exploiting cracks in the Russia-Iran partnership, both in supply vulnerabilities and political calculus, becomes a strategic objective that goes beyond the battlefield and into the realm of alliance behavior and geopolitical alignment. Everything we just talked about happening primarily in Russia and Ukraine, but also in Iran, paints a picture not of a simple escalation or decline in hostilities, but of a multidimensional conflict where the tactical, operational, diplomatic and economic layers are all deeply interconnected. Over the last 24 hours, the shape of this conflict has continued to shift in subtle but meaningful ways, with Ukraine reporting relative territorial advances during February, diplomacy facing venue uncertainty amid global tensions, and the war economy's supply chains revealing cracks in sanctions enforcement that have broader implications for how this war is fought. And just like this, all these developments underscore a fundamental truth, that this conflict is not static. And while emotional headlines may dominate public attention, it is the interplay of battlefield operations, diplomatic engagement, and global supply networks that ultimately shape outcomes over the long term. Guys, if you want deeper strategic analysis on these ongoing developments, unpacking what they mean not just for today but for the coming days, weeks and months, please make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss our daily briefings. Don't forget about the Patreon, the link is down below, and also please let me know down below in the comments if you do like this new style of videos, which is now not that much of a video essay, but top news of the day reporting, with a little bit of my commentary. Thanks so much, let me know, and see you.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.